Hopefully that works. All right, so let's open there. Going live. All right, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Dr. Will's Straight to Tape, episode 6, with myself, Dr. Will O'Connor, endurance sports educator, athlete, and sports scientist. This week, I'm talking about, distance versus time. It's a debate that is as long as training prescription, really, and I definitely go back and forth about it a lot. And what reminded me of it was yesterday I was doing some 2K intervals with a training partner, and he was taking a little bit longer than me. Nothing crazy, maybe 10, 20 seconds or so. And I was thinking about the fact that I'd prescribed these 2K intervals to another athlete whose threshold was about a minute per K slower than mine. So mine's around 320, 330 minutes per K threshold, and these were zone 4 threshold intervals so 2Ks at zone 4 threshold. And then I was thinking, well, if I've prescribed these and their threshold is about 430, still pretty quick, 430 minutes per K, and mine's 330, and I'm 320. So I did them, each of them was under 7 minutes. So let's just say they took me 7 minutes to do 2Ks. And then someone else with a minute slower for 2Ks is now doing 9 minutes. And then if your threshold is around 5 minutes, you're going to be doing 10 minutes. Now, 7 minutes at threshold times 3 is very different than 10 minutes at threshold. I mean, that's a 30-minute total threshold versus a 21-minute total threshold time within the interval. So essentially, comparatively, I should be doing 4 intervals, 4 2Ks versus someone who has like a minute to a minute and a half slower threshold than me if they're doing 30 minutes and they're doing 3 2Ks. So it really had me thinking, well, what is going to be the best way for me to prescribe intervals? Because when I was thinking about myself and then comparatively slower athletes who would be taking longer for a 2K, well, if you're running 10 kilometers, there's no hiding that, right? Like the distance is the distance. You're running a half marathon, you got to run essentially 21.1 Ks and marathon distance. So when we're prescribing distance in that sense, those distance intervals and sessions just have to be distance prescribed. And that's where you have a range, or you always should have a range in your threshold that you're trying to hit. So when we look at zone 4, have it up here. It depends on what you're using, but if I'm using running power, Jim Vance's running power zones, I've got why don't I show you? I can bring them up here if I can just find my mouse for those that are watching. So if we're looking at zone 4, we've got 96% of your threshold to 105, and then a little bit higher than that into like those VO2 max, like super threshold, anaerobic capacity stuff. You're going like 100, pretty much beyond 100%, and you're starting to work above your anaerobic threshold. So 96 to 105, and then when we're looking at pace zones, it's always around that 100, and it's going to be some kind of 94, 95% all the way up to 100 or 100+%. And that's why those ranges and zones are so good when you're prescribing training and you're prescribing distance, because what you're able to do is within that 2Ks, like I can go right to the top of the zone and smash those out, because overall, if I'm doing a 3x2K session and lead up to what's coming up for me, which is a 10K season on the road, and I'll progress those intervals into 4x2K and then like 3x3K, and I can work at the top end of that zone. Now, someone who I need to prescribe 2K or distance-based intervals for, they can go right to the bottom of the zone, and that's very different. Like if you're right on your threshold and then you're 5% below it, that's going to be very different and probably more aligned with the intensity you'll be running for the entire distance, if that makes sense. I've kind of confused myself on that one, so I'll explain it. So what I mean by that is we need to do distance-based intervals when we're training for a distance-based event. So if we're training for a 5K, 10K, those distance-based events, then at some point we have to do a distance-based interval session, because there's no way around being able to do just duration-based. So what we need to do is we need to do some, let's say these 2K intervals, but we need to do them at an intensity that is relative to the intensity you're going to do the, let's say, 10-kilometer at. So for me, because I'm going just over 30 minutes, I'm going to be able to hold a much higher percentage of my threshold than someone who's going to be running 40 to 45 minutes. So then in the prescription of those intervals, that needs to align with the prescription of the intensity you're going to be running that race at. Now, if we were going to use duration-based intervals, if I'm going to be doing 3 by 10 minutes, and we're all doing 3 by 10 minutes, then I might not be able to reach the same intensity that I would need to within the race. And then someone else, again, may be exercising at too low an intensity relative to what they're going to be doing in the race. And that can be hard to predict based off of, I guess, if you're just prescribing intervals in a ready-made training plan, or like what I'm going through now, putting a book together, and you've got to be able to say, these are the intervals that you need to do. So for someone who's going to do 40 minutes, and I'm going to do 30 minutes, prescribing 4 by 10 minutes at, your like threshold essentially, and that zone 4, which is relative about to what you'll be doing for the race. Well, there's no way I should be doing 4 by 10 minutes when I'm only going to take 30 minutes to do the entire race. I'd be absolutely gassed. But then someone who's going to be doing 40 minutes, that is a relative measure, which is similar to me doing 3 by 10. But then when we go to a distance-based prescription, so these 3 by 2Ks moving into 4 by 2Ks, and maybe even getting up to 5 by 2K, but most people don't really have the capacity within their training to do that at race pace. Then you're directly comparing the distance and the intensity relative to the distance and the intensity and duration that you're going to be racing. So I hope that makes sense in terms of prescribing distance-based intervals for distance-based events. And then we get into the distance duration prescription for just, let's say, everyday runs. And I'm saying runs because that's the majority of my audience, and that's just the thought process I had over the last couple of days that I wanted to get across. And really, so when I say distance to time prescription, that's like you want to do a 10K aerobic run, zone 2, or you want to do 5Ks at tempo, so zone 3, recovery 5Ks at zone 1, versus say 1 hour at zone 2, 30 minutes intensity at zone 3 at 30 minutes at zone 3, versus the 5K or the 6K. And for pretty much the majority of what I call like bread and butter aerobic development training, I love to prescribe duration-based prescription or like training, because then it doesn't matter. Everyone has approximately the same amount of time in their day when we're looking at your full-time everyday, or let's call them weekend warrior athlete. They have an hour to 90-minute block during the day, maybe twice a day, generally just once, and then they've got the big block of time in the weekend. And so when I prescribe an hour or 45 minutes to 60 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, some of my like consistent prescription durations, then it doesn't really matter what that athlete is in terms of their capability or their overall fitness, because there's a certain minimum duration that they're going to need to get performance enhancement. And the only thing that's going to differ there is the speed at which they're moving. The other thing with distance and duration and using duration is you can go on a trail, you can go straight up a hill, and it doesn't really matter how fast or slow you're running, you still have to run for 45 to 60 minutes. And so that is a super easy way to just blanketly prescribe training, ensure no one is going over or under, or there's no huge differentiation in the training duration based off of fitness level. So when you've got someone who can run 4-minute Ks just aerobically, and you prescribe them a 10K run, aerobic 10K run, and then you have someone who's running 6-minute Ks aerobically, that becomes 40 minutes versus 1 hour. And that's just this, and it's essentially this, it's the same workout, but someone's going to get a far larger aerobic stimulus from that, even though they're less fit. And that clearly just doesn't make any sense. So the only time I really prescribe like a distance-based prescription, like for an aerobic workout, is when, again, we have like these long runs in the weekend, and I know the athlete is needing to build up to a distance-based event, which pretty much everyone is. This isn't cycling. We're not going for like 20-minute time trials or unknown really events and stuff that's really durational based. We're looking at marathons and ultra marathons and half marathons. So you need to run 25Ks. And it doesn't really matter in terms of building fitness what that intensity or duration is, but you need to do 25Ks in the weekend. So then you're going to prescribe a long run at 25Ks. And then when we get beyond that into the ultra marathon, and I'm trying to prescribe, geez, who knows what someone's capacity is, when and where they're running when you're building up for an ultra marathon. So let's say it's a 50K. Now, 50Ks around New Zealand, let alone around the world, differ so hugely in their terrain, like underfoot, and their topography in terms of like the up and down, the meters of elevation. And even within the meters of elevation, you've got to take into account the terrain, the steepness, and everything in between, the conditions as to how long that race is going to take. So then it's a real juggling act when you're looking at prescribing duration or distance for a ultra marathon. Because if you've got a 50K ultra, I would like someone to at least do 40Ks. But depending on where they live, and if their race is going to take them, say, 8 hours, but in training, it's going to take them 7 hours to run a 40K or even 35K, then that's probably not going to be a lot of running. And so I wrote an article on this. I have to see if I've published it because it was for a magazine, New Zealand Trail Running Magazine, or New Zealand Australia Trail Running Magazine. And it was this real argument of what is the stimulus you're going to get out from being out for 7 hours, especially if you're moving like slowly and unable to really get into, say, zone 2 or upper zone 2, maybe even finishing in bottom of zone 3, versus running consistently, maybe walking a bit of the steep uphills for 4 hours. So yes, you may be out there for 6 hours, but actually how much stimulus have you got versus if you were able to run for 4 hours? So although you may be out there for 8 hours, in terms of training and compiling your training together, because that 4 hours of running is going to come off the back of maybe some 2K intervals, maybe a week of these 1 hour runs, hill reps, so you're going to carry a lot of fatigue into it. So by saying, yeah, you need to run a certain distance before you do a certain distance event, when we're talking about ultra marathons here, when we're talking about marathons, it kind of, you need to, if you're going to predict your time and accurately determine your pacing strategy, you need to be able to do 20Ks within a session of approximately probably 30Ks at marathon pace. Because if you're able to do a 30K total run with at least 20Ks of at marathon pace work, and you're able to execute that appropriately, and we can track your power outputs, heart rates, to make sure they're not going above threshold zones, then we can say, very, very accurately that this is within your realm of possibility and you can target this time. So we're going to have a far better predictive association with your actual output that you can do in the race, rather than doing these random guesstimates or just hoping you'll get under 3 hours or 4 hours, 3.5 hours, whatever your goal time is. So marathons, we have so much data and predictive capabilities and models we can fit from your training that it has to be distance based, and you have to do a certain intensity at over a certain distance, and we can then directly associate that with all the non-data we have on marathons over the decades that people have been running them. When we get into ultras, ultras just such a random and new ballpark in terms of the amount of data we have. It becomes very hard to say, all right, if you can do 30 Ks on 500 meters of elevation at zone 3 heart rate, or maintain zone 2 power, then you'll be able to do this in the race. Because the reality is, we don't know that kind of information yet. And so for the most part, what I do for ultras is associate a duration based prescription for the workouts, the long runs. And then what we can do with the duration base is, with duration, that's how we've tested everything in the lab. That's how we've determined your anaerobic capacity, your peak and anaerobic outputs. That's how we've determined the anaerobic aerobic crossover point. That's how we've determined all these physiological and biochemical actions that occur while at exercise, while at certain percentages of your VO2 max, which we've measured in the lab through gas exchange. So all of those are time-based, they're not distance-based. A lot of the time we've done them on the bike, but and treadmill's an accurate distance. But of course, 10 minutes for you is 10 minutes for me. So what that allows us to do is at least be able to accurately prescribe a intensity based off of a duration. And so for ultra marathons, when we're again working our way backwards from the actual kind of duration ballpark we know you're going to take to finish that event, and then we can associate an intensity with that. And then what we can do is either decide if that intensity that you're going to be able to complete 50 Ks. So for me, it's around 4 hours depending on the course. Maybe it's a little bit over 4 hours, maybe it's a little bit under. That's totally runnable. We know I can work at zone 3 for 4 hours based off of the data I know and the capacity, and as long as I'm fueling myself and what we know from the overall data within science, right? The human physiology. But then when it starts to go beyond that, when we start to look at 6, 7, 8 hours, we need to say, okay, well, you're not going to be able to exercise at zone 3, maybe even peak out zone 4, going over some short climbs. There's going to be no recovery points there. So what's going to be the best training stimulus and adaptation response for you based off of your lifestyle and your time availability, right? So is that going to be doing 2 hours top of zones 3? Or is that going to be getting out and doing some kind of essentially brisk jog, hike situation on some really tough terrain to work on conditioning more than working on fitness? So that is some of the random arguments I have and thought processes with myself when I'm looking at someone's training and I'm trying to figure out what athlete are they, how do they fit in, how does the stimulus and physiology associate with their lifestyle and their end goal. And maybe, hopefully, that's helpful for you and you're able to follow along. But yeah, until next week, guys. Make sure you check me out on all of the social medias. Instagram, this one goes up on Spotify and Anchor podcasts, Apple Podcasts. It's just search it, Dr. Lewis Straight to Tape. And it doesn't look like my whole internet and computer crash this time. So that's all good. Also, check out the Performance Advantage podcast that I do with Dr. Matt Miller, and these also go up on YouTube. So